Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Let's Brief It, the podcast by law students for law students. I'm Tamaya Anderson, a second-year student at Howard University School of Law. Today, I'm joined by Mike Walker, a 2021 graduate of Howard University School of Law. After graduating, Mike served as a law clerk to 3 federal judges, Judge Janet Bond Arterton of the District of Connecticut, Judge Roger L. Gregory of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and Judge LaShawn D.R.C. Hall of the Eastern District of New York. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
Awesome, and we're happy to have you. So we'll start just with you briefly telling us what prompted you to pursue your law career.
Well, I was a public policy major in college, and I really enjoyed that, just thinking about how the world works from a governmental or societal perspective. And so when I was thinking about careers, public policy isn't really something you can just make into a job. I always had an affinity for, shows like Law and Order and things like that, and in just courtroom stuff. And so I figured that law would be a good way to be the next step in my public policy minded sort of perspective on the world. And so just in the same way that some of the topics we discussed in my public policy classes in college, the law affects almost everything that we do in society. And so that's basically how my passion for the law grew.
Awesome. And then can you tell us specifically how you decided you wanted to clerk for judges, and when and how did you know that you wanted to do multiple clerkships after graduating?
So going into law school, I didn't have any connections to judges or anything like that. And so, what actually ended up happening to me was in my first week of law school, before classes even started, it was during orientation. We had at Howard, at the end of orientation, we have a little ceremony that sort of welcomes us into the school, and there's a keynote address speaker, and it was Judge D.R.C. Hall, and she gave a phenomenal speech. I was hooked. At that moment, I said to myself, I want to, I want to work for her, and I had a little bit of understanding of just like what clerkships were just from doing research into law schools before I ended up going to Howard. So I had an idea that you could work for a judge. And so, I was just so captured by her presence, her speech, everything about her energy. And so, as soon as I had the opportunity, I applied for an internship for her, and I ended up, completing that internship right after my first year of law school, and that internship cemented my desire to be a law clerk, because I was around law clerks. I was in a judge's chambers. I really liked the environment. I loved the work, and the law clerks were people I sort of looked up to, and so I thought to myself, okay, I want to be one of those people. As far as doing multiple clerkships, I realized as I was going through law school and thinking more about what it is I want to do for my career as a lawyer, it dawned on me that many of the people in the positions that I'm interested in hopefully assuming at some point in my career had clerkships, and they had different types of clerkships, and some of them even had multiple clerkships, and many of them had a trial court experience and an appeals court experience. And so I figured to myself that those opportunities seemed like opportunities that would be well worth me also pursuing. And so I ended up with 3 clerkships. Actually, didn't really mean to do 3, but what I really wanted to do was just the trial court and the appeals court. But it just worked out that sometimes you just have to do that 3rd clerkship for just to get the experiences that you really want to get.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of segue perfectly into the next question, especially with Judge D.R.C. Hall. But how did you decide which judges you wanted to apply to for your clerkships?
Well, because I did 3 clerkships, it was each one of them I was a little bit of a different consideration. And so and actually this gives me an opportunity to explain a little bit more why I did 3, because I would say that's a very uncommon experience for among people who pursue a clerkship. So for me, as I mentioned, I wanted to do the trial court and the appeals court. And so when I was applying, I applied to some some federal appeals courts, and I applied to a couple of district court clerkships. But to be honest with you, I was really hoping that I could clerk for Judge DRC Hall after interning with her. And so none of these clerkship opportunities are guaranteed. I'm sure people who are interested in clerking recognize that. And so you want to cast a bit of a wide net. You don't want to be too picky. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You'll get all kinds of advice like that. And so I did that, and I ended up just with the fortunate position where on the same day I ended up just getting an offer to clerk for Judge Arterton and an offer to clerk for Judge Gregory, and so I accepted those clerkships, but I had an interview scheduled for Judge DRC Hall, and so I was like, wow, she's really the reason why I wanted to clerk in the first place, and that's actually how I ended up at 3, because she was the last judge that I interviewed with, and I really, I just wanted to develop that relationship. And so the reason why I wanted to develop that relationship is really fundamental to your question, which is that I had the good fortune of being in an environment experiencing the personality behind the robe, and I really enjoyed the standard that she set in her chambers. And so, to the extent people who are interested in clerkships are able to intern for judges who are willing to hire their interns, or engage in other opportunities where they actually get to meet the people who are making these decisions on the bench, like that's a really invaluable experience, and it can help shape a student's decision to apply to one judge or another. And so I really do think that one of the considerations for me across the judges I clerked for was understanding their reputation as a person, and not necessarily a political reputation or any sort of specific interests in a topic that they might have familiarity with, but really just like what is their philosophy of law, what is their background, does their background influence how they view the facts of a case, or how they view mentorship. Those sorts of more human qualities, I think, really go a long way in helping people understand like who might be a good fit to clerk for, because this is a very intimate environment. And I think the best clerkship experiences, in my experience and the experiences of others who I know that have clerked, have been with personality types that just made sense for the law clerk as much as they made sense for the judge.
I'm really glad that you bring up like kind of trying to get to know the judges in whatever capacity that you're able to. Of course, sometimes that can be harder depending on how accessible they are, but especially with you having done 3 federal clerkships, I think for, people who are listening to this episode who are likely interested in clerking, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but federal clerkships are prestigious and people are often want to pursue them, and maybe can kind of get pigeonholed in just looking at who appointed that judge, and like having that kind of be the determining factor for whether they apply to them, if they accept the offer or whatever. And so I appreciate you kind of bringing up figuring out sort of creative ways to get to know the judges before you ultimately commit, and make sure that it's a right fit for you, both ideologically, but also just your approach to the law, regardless of who they were appointed by or where you stand on every specific issue.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say that each of the judges that I clerked for were appointed by a different president. So ironically, one a judge who was appointed by a president associated with a particular party and particular political stance may surprise you in how they actually decide law. I wouldn't just stop at the name of the president appointing the human who's making these decisions, whether it's a federal judge or a state judge.
Absolutely. So moving on to the next question, what resources or advice did you take advantage of in law school that you feel has supported your clerkship experiences?
Well, so I think that most schools have somebody, whether it's one person or maybe it's a committee of people who have the keeper of the keys when it comes to judicial clerkships. They might have connections to judges or other resources for students. So I would definitely start there. I know that Howard specifically has a committee that provides resources and support for students. So that's one place where I would start, but I wouldn't stop there. And I think that my experience was one where perseverance will, I think, will get you really far, not just in the clerkship context, but in law in general, because I think a lot of the industry moves in very similar ways. And so I think that doing individual research is can be a really, really helpful thing for students. There's a lot of information out there on the internet that is free. And so I honestly did a lot of just like personal research on like on and then to visualize what exactly I wanted out of a clerkship experience and what it even meant to clerk. And there's forums, there's Reddit, so like I wouldn't even shy away from some of those more informal communities of people who are talking about the same things because many of those people are in the same situation who they don't really know what's going on, so they're hoping that the find answers from others. But so I would definitely do individual research. I would talk to professors. I would identify professors who might have clerked. I would identify individuals whose role it is to help students find clerkship opportunities at your school. And now I was actually fortunate to be part of a pipeline organization called the Appellate Project that they actually didn't have such a robust clerkship resource when I was looking for clerkships, but now they do. And so I would absolutely sign up. You can go on the website, just Google the Appellate Project. It should be the first result. And I really want to plug that because it's an awesome resource for clerkships in general. It doesn't even need to be appellate clerkships. I know the name sounds like it is, but it's actually more robust than that. It's just any clerkships. So there's a lot, in the year 2025, there's a ton of internet research that's out there for people interested in clerkships.
Thank you for sharing that. And so, moving forward, what would be your advice for students who are interested in clerking but don't feel that they are the best quote unquote candidate on paper, and maybe are a little bit insecure about GPA or how they did in certain classes? What would kind of be your advice to those students who might be listening?
And that's a really great question, and I really appreciate that one because I think it can be really intimidating for people to try to apply to clerkships. And I think the advice where people say don't self-select yourself out of an opportunity is is most salient in this particular conversation. I think a lot of people just don't even apply because they don't think they're the type of candidate that judges are looking for. And I really think that's a false narrative because there is no one type of candidate that judges are looking for. Not every single law clerk that I clerked with, who I came across, went to a top 14 law school. I didn't go to a top 14 law school, and I got to clerk with some phenomenal judges in competitive application processes too. And you don't need straight A's either. There's many different proxies for how well you might do in a clerkship that judges will look at. And I think when it comes to candidates who may not have gone to a top school, who may not have top grades, who might not have been on a flagship, law journal, those students just what they need to do is think about how they stand out, what opportunities they can get involved in to demonstrate the same acumen that other law clerks are able to demonstrate, successful law clerk applications demonstrate. And that might be a individual research project that you do with a professor where you come up with an idea that interests you as a law student and you ask a professor just to steward you through that. That shows initiative. That's an opportunity where you can get the same sort of writing experience you would get on a law journal. And I think it actually shows a little bit more courage than the average law student, and that might stand out to some judges. There are other creative ways that you can sort of demonstrate that you are the type of candidate that judges are looking for to help them decide cases. And the last thing I want to say about that is this is exactly why I think it is really important for the students who are interested in clerking to do their research on judges they're interested in clerking for, and to find out as best they can if that judge is amenable to hiring law students who don't sort of fit a quote unquote traditional path. They're out there. If you can tap into their network, you might see former clerks who went to law schools that aren't top 14 schools, or you might talk to a former law clerk who actually, despite what it appears to be, they didn't have the best grades, but they might have done something else to stand out. So it's really important just to get a holistic perspective on these things and identify the quote unquote weaknesses in your resume and just find a creative way to supplement that weakness.
And moving on to kind of maybe some practical things that the listeners can be thinking about. What should students be doing in their 1L, 2L, and 3L years if they're interested in clerking to, as you say, figure out how to set themselves apart and really make themselves the best candidate, of course, including studying hard to make sure that they get the grades that they want. But what kind of tangible steps can we be taking in this process now?
Of course, beyond just do your best, I would say that judges really do care a lot about journal experience. So to the extent you're able to be a member of a law journal, I would encourage you to do it. It's not necessary in the sense that you will not get a clerkship if you do not do that. But the name of the game here is to make it as easy as possible for you to get as many clerkship interviews that you can, so you have a choice. And so, to the extent you're able to, definitely engage in journal experience. If you or do moot court experience or trial advocacy, something that allows you to sort of develop other skills that are applicable to the job of a law clerk. And so that's going to be a lot of research and writing, which is why journal is great. Attempt to be a research assistant for a professor. That's an opportunity also to get experience of research and writing. There's different, if you're not part of the moot court team that your school sponsors, there are moot court opportunities through BOLSA and other organizations that you can get involved in. See if you can find a friend who is willing to be your partner and challenge yourselves in that way. There are writing competitions. There are all kinds of writing competitions where there's a prompt and you can write a law review type article and submit it to the essay competition. It doesn't really even matter if you win. The fact that you did it is an opportunity for you to have a writing sample that a judge can look at and say, okay, this person has the qualities that I'm looking for when it comes to research and writing to be a successful law clerk in my chambers. So those are different opportunities I think that people can affirmatively engage in to help themselves be better clerkship candidates.
Thank you for giving those very clear things that you can do today or you can apply for, you can kind of start preparing for, because I think that that's really helpful for people. And so shifting to your experience in your respective clerkships, can you just tell us a little bit about the differences in your day-to-day work in your appellate clerkship versus your trial level clerkships?
Sure. So the way I look at it is the differences really can be distilled into the function of each of those courts. So in the trial court, the business that's happening there is developing the record and motion practice. And so, anybody who's taken civil procedure probably has a general understanding of the different types of motions that may be filed in the trial court. And those are all motions that the court will have to deal with, and thus the law clerks will deal with. And so the challenge for a law clerk in the district court at the federal level, but it's probably not too different in state trial courts as well, is that there are a multitude of cases on a trial judge's docket, and she relies on her law clerks to sort through those cases and keep up to date with the motions that are being filed and provide some sort of usually written feedback to the judge about how to resolve a particular motion or how the facts are resolved. Factual, I should say, factual distinctions or differences or disputes are resolved. And it's really about giving recommendations to the trial judge as to those different types of motions. When we're talking about civil practice, And then in the criminal context, a lot of times it's helping the judge calculate sentencing guidelines, resolve disputes with respect to a criminal defendant's rights, and of course, conducting trials both civilly and criminally. And so those trials are pretty big components of the clerkship because trials can be lengthy, they can be really complicated legally and factually. And so the law clerk's job really is to help the judge make quick, efficient, and accurate decisions in a pretty fast moving environment. In contrast, the appeals court is a little bit slower. There's fewer cases. The questions on appeal are questions of law, so the record has already been established. There is no fact finding. There's no factual disputes that need to be resolved. It's really just what is the law in this area. Sometimes a law clerk's job in the appeals court is just to confirm that on the facts that were developed in the record below in the trial court, the law is clearly established here, and we just apply those facts to clearly established law and affirm or reverse the trial court's decision based on the court's read of those facts and law. Other times, the law is in dispute, and that's when the appeals court has to engage in sometimes a very academic analysis of what the law is or what it should be. And the law clerk's job is really just to identify those distinctions or unclear aspects of the law and give a recommendation as to how to resolve those unclear aspects of the law to the judge. And of course, appeals court judges usually sit in panels. And so it's not just a recommendation to your judge that you click for, but ultimately it's a recommendation for your judge to bring to his or her colleagues. And so there's some other considerations when it comes to the recommendations that law clerks in the appeals court have to make that a little bit different than the recommendations in the trial court, just because of the number of judges who are involved in making that decision.
And kind of rounding out our questions here, how should our listeners who are interested in clerking be thinking about pursuing federal versus state clerkships, or any combination of the two?
So as you know, I clerk for federal judges, and so that doesn't mean that I wasn't interested in state clerkships. I actually did apply and talk to some former clerks for state court judges. It just so happened that the way things shook out for me was that I ended up clerking for federal judges. But I really do think that state courts can be very valuable experiences. I know some people who have clerked for state court judges and really enjoyed those experiences. I think when you're thinking about whether you should do a state or federal, there's a lot of different considerations. And, I think if you're interested in just clerking and getting a fulsome experience of how the law is decided in a more general sense, I think federal courts tend to be a better path there, just because federal courts deal with broader analyses of the law than state courts tend to. State courts, of course, only really deal with state law, and so it can be a little bit more limited in that sense. But I will say that on the other hand, if you are from a particular state and you know you're going to go back to that state and practice, a state court clerkship might be a better idea, because it'll help you understand the law of your state, your jurisdiction better than a federal court will, even a federal court in that jurisdiction, because federal courts aren't always going to be dealing with questions of state law. Of course, sometimes they do, but many times they don't. So I would actually suggest that anybody who knows they want to practice in a particular jurisdiction should really consider state court clerkships in that jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. And finally, do you have any closing thoughts or advice for our law student listeners?
My only thought that I guess is really just a reiteration that I really think that people who are at all interested in clerking should really run down that possibility and think about it, and not think about all the successful people who have clerked and feel intimidated that maybe you don't have the same success. Because a lot of people who have clerked, they felt the same way that you did, and before they had that experience, and they just put themselves out there. So I really just encourage people to put themselves out there if that's something that they're really interested in doing. And I don't think it's ever too late to apply for a clerkship. So I guess that's the other thing I want to underscore. A lot of people apply in law school and they are successful. Some people wait a year or two and they apply after they've been practicing for a little bit. I actually know of a law clerk who was a partner at a law firm before clerking. So it really is never too late to engage in a pursuit of a clerkship. So I really would encourage anybody who's thinking about a clerkship, whether they're in law school or in practice, to go ahead and put yourself out there.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And thank you to the DC Bar students community for hosting us. Until next time.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
The DC Bar law student community strives to engage and support law students before you graduate and expose you to the tangible benefits of joining the DC Bar and DC Bar communities. Curated programming allows law students to participate in leadership trainings, substantive content programming, networking with practicing attorneys in fields of interest, writing opportunities, and other activities designed to expand your legal education beyond the classroom. Make an investment in your legal career by joining the law student community. To learn more, visit us at www.dcbar.org or email communities@dcbar.org.